Yeah, Matt from Westland Distillery. Should be said. We're Wanderback Whiskey. You guys are Westland Distillery. That's right, eh? That's the right
Mhm.
name.
We try, yeah.
Yeah, it's great to see you, man. I was saying earlier how good it was to hear your voice and see your face. I remember it's been a long time. I was reading the notes of how long it's been since when we worked together, and it's been a bunch of years.
When was
A lot of
it?
things.
Actually, I can't remember.
It's like 7 years.
Was it really?
Yeah.
Huh. Wild.
And
Oh
I
man.
remember I remember some of it like it was yesterday, but yeah, it's a real treat to have you. I know you're busy. Well, it's a weird time, and time is funny these days. Some things go slow and some things go fast, but it's really nice to have you on the show today. And I was saying to you, my wife has made me this Wanderback couch. I feel like I'm going to get swallowed up here in a minute and carried away.
I feel like that's very nice of your wife to make you an entire couch.
Right? Well, it was a couch, but it got covered in various paraphernalia. But
Ah, fantastic.
Um, anyways, it's good to see you. And so our listeners here are, I'm sure, are fans as we are. But I'd like to go back. I'd like to go back to hear from you, your background, and some of the things that led you to get into this industry.
Boy. It's kind of funny, first of all, because we've been doing a lot of these too, and I'm used to being on the other side of it. So I have actually haven't answered a lot of these questions recently, so it's
Oh,
kind of
good. Can
it's
you
kind of
tell me if
funny.
there's some questions that I don't answer that I should, please? Because you've probably got more practice than I
Yeah, I don't. I mean, we're all stumbling through this the best we can. So,
have.
um, no. So, um, I started on this journey with, I guess, a really big interest in flavor. Um, Growing up as a kid, no idea why. Um, really interested in flavor and really interested in simplicity at the same time. And so, growing up, looking at the way things tasted different from each other, in foods. And for me, the most interesting versions of that were were things that were very simple, things that were prepared simply, very few ingredients. Why does scalloped potatoes, if you've had scalloped potatoes before, taste different from this version in a box versus made at home? Few ingredients, but it could be wildly different. And long story, relatively short, that eventually translated to whiskey. Yeah, and distilling to me was a very interesting subject because of the mystery involved of taking this thing, this humble, simple thing. In our shared case, it's the barley grain, and turning that into something that has a huge variety of flavors. I mean, whiskey is one of the most complex beverages on the planet, and it's made with four ingredients. So how do you do that? And that's the thing that was really appealing to me. I think for a lot of people, you become a chef because there's potential in all the stuff that you get to use. For me, the appealing thing about whiskey is in what you don't get to use, right? You've got four things, and that restriction is the source of creativity. And it's a challenge, and I like a challenge. So that's where we kind of started. And I started the project really really young. Dropped out of university, went and enrolled in a program in Scotland, Heriot-Watt University, post-grad degree in brewing and distilling science. I didn't have my undergrad degree because I dropped out, but they let me continue with that so long as I held a minimum standard for my prereqs in biochem, stuff like that. And that was really really exciting, great program. But at the same time, I was also influenced by the Pacific Northwest, this place that you and I, we call home. And there's a lot to love about the Pacific Northwest, the way people think, the sources of creativity that exist, the beer industry, the wine industry, the food industry now especially, and that formed an equal kind of source of input on the way that I viewed whiskey. It's one lens, and or one foot in tradition and one foot kind of in this. Well, I'm a product of this place, born and bred, in the Pacific Northwest, and that helped us influence the way that we pursued Westland. We saw a lot of potential in single malt whiskey. This is 2010 when we started it, and you know, I had got all this formal training in Scotland, but all that formal training in Scotland didn't teach you how to change things. It was about stasis. It was about keeping things the way that it was. But it was the other stuff, the Pacific Northwest side of stuff that drew me in and allowed us to push to creating a new style of whiskey. And to me, I mean, that was kind of apparent when we started the company, but the magnitude of it didn't really hit me until we kept going to realize, wait a second, we're on to something here. The Pacific Northwest is one of the best barley growing climates in the world. It's a better barley growing climate than Scotland. That's the dirty little secrets.
Right.
But it's also, we have an approach here that a lot of people are taking, and we can add something new and interesting. And how exciting is it to be able to say, here is a thing that represents my home, and that's emotionally, like, that's a very satisfying thing to be able to do. And ever since we started Westland, and since, of course, obviously before that, that's been the journey. Simply put, is just trying to represent this place that we know and love.
That's great. I remember when we started working, we'll get more into that sort of beginnings when we worked together closely, but you had just transitioned from the small distillery down in South Seattle to the present one,
It
and
was 7 years ago, wasn't it? Yeah. Holy
yeah,
smokes.
it was
Yeah.
just then, and I remember seeing that facility that you guys built, and I was obviously impressed. It's an amazing place. And I was wondering, when was the time when you were, because clearly you've had a long background of developing taste and nose and appreciating, like you say, ingredients and simple ingredients to make amazing tasting things, food and beverage. Um, when was it that you thought that when did you start to get the confidence that you were actually making something that people were going to like? Or when did you start to think that this was something that people were really going to appreciate maybe as much as you did?
2013, 2014.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, that's
Right.
the trick. There's a period of time where it's very stressful,
Oh
actually.
yeah.
You know
Yeah.
what we were trying to do is, we were trying, the old the old joke that I would like to tell people is, we had this pitch going into starting this business of, we're going to make a product that's never been made successfully in the United States before, the most expensive raw ingredient you could possibly use. We have no idea how it's going to taste, and we'll have no revenue for at least 3 years. And like,
What do you think?
let's go for it. And but even more so than that, we were trying to do something new from the outset, right?
Yeah.
We weren't trying to replicate the Scottish style. Not that there's anything wrong with the Scottish style, and I want to be very clear about that.
No,
They're
no.
making great whiskey, but from the outset, it was very clear that we wanted to do something new,
Yeah.
to make a Pacific Northwest style of single malts. And that was terrifying,
Yeah.
genuinely, like, for those 3 years, 2010 to 2013 into 2014, whether people were going to get it or
Yeah.
not.
Yeah.
Um, and that, there's an element of that. And I feel like, to a certain degree, we've achieved a lot. We've proven ourselves, in terms of quality, but that is always at the back of your mind.
Yeah.
It's our duty, distillers, to produce something at the end of the day that's amazing. You can have the best philosophy driving, your whiskey making style, but if it doesn't taste good, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
So that's something that's always there. We're always trying to push that. But when we first started seeing reviews and stuff coming in for whiskeys that were 3 or 4 years old and that were getting really high scores off of a concept, we're saying, okay, we're going to base our whiskey's flavor profile not on the amount of time in barrels, but off of the flavor of the malted barley and the flavor of the yeast. That hadn't been done before, not in Scotland.
Right.
So that was a big leap, and we bet everything on that.
Yeah.
The whole concept.
I spent time. I did some of the courses with Harriet Water, and I did the summer school as well, and I enjoyed that immensely. And like you said, I mean, well, you did mention. I think we've talked about it. Just having that base of knowledge, the basic concepts that school was so good at. I mean, they have such a heritage, and but learning those because I remember speaking to you about various things that you were prioritizing in the distillery, like for example the types of grains you were using, the roller mill that you were using, you were talking about phase separate, the oil separation, these sorts of things. And I remember reading about those things in the various texts that we had available to us. And so, I mean, it seemed to me like what you were doing is, using the available knowledge, using the bed of knowledge that school, and I'm sure other books and people gave you, but then adding some things that seem to, and it's actually, I've said this many times, I'm Canadian, but it's one of the things I love about America is Americans, I think as a culture, well, first of all, as a culture, we're less afraid to fail, I think, than other cultures.
Agreed.
And because anytime you try something new, like you just said, there's a risk of failing, big time. And especially when you're using other people's money, it's fairly stressful. But yeah,
you're telling me.
Yeah, so I really liked that when I first talked to you and the folks at the distillery, was this appreciation for the knowledge that we were getting from UK and Scotland and Ireland and others, but then adding an American, changing some things because we thought they would work, like, and we'll go into that, but but you're from the Pacific Northwest, right?
Yeah, I grew up in the Tacoma area.
That's right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And okay, great. So,
but I think I would just say I totally agree with you that point about the willing to take more risks, and I think that's one of the more interesting things as we've seen single malts developing in Canada versus the US.
Yes.
Canadian single malts tend to be much more conservative. It nothing to do with quality, but from a stylistic standpoint, much more conservative, whereas the American ones are pushing things a lot further forward. And to me, that's fascinating. And to me, that's the beauty of seeing single malt grow, not just in America, but outside of Scotland in general.
Yeah.
Is that there's an adaptation, and mostly an unconscious one, of national character or of culture that is kind of an imprint on the whiskey.
Yeah, and you mentioned a few things about the Pacific Northwest that are unique and that sort of lend themselves to this whole thing. And the beer movement that we've witnessed over the past 15, 20 years is a big one for me, actually. And so where I came from with this to then start working with you and your group is I have a similar appreciation for taste and flavor and simple ingredients made in simple ways, and tradition as well. I have a real appreciation for tradition, and I have always been. I've loved whiskey from my father was a Scotch and Canadian whiskey drinker, and then I also love beer, and I remember coming to America, and my friends mostly introduced me to bourbons and ryes, which I like, but the rye here was not the same as the rye that what I would have called rye back home in Canada, the Crown Royals and these ones. And so I had an appreciation for whiskey, and I did like the bourbons and ryes, but they weren't necessarily my favorite. And then I started to appreciate what Stranahan's was doing initially, and St. George was a bit later, but then it was Westland. I remember tasting Westland, some of the early releases of Westland, and I was blown away. I thought I'd never tasted anything like it, and it really appealed to me from a taste standpoint. And then through a common person, I was introduced to Steve Hawley, who introduced me to you, and through the various jigs and reels, we worked together. And I don't know if you remember this, but I came to you with a grain bill. I said, "What do you think of this?" Because I was doing various barley teas and making beers without much hops to see what how we could make the various tastes, and then also appreciating those whiskeys that I just mentioned. And then I remember throwing back ideas to you, and I don't know if you remember that back and forth.
Oh yeah, that was really fun.
It was really fun.
Yeah.
And it was so nice to because I was going. I mean, you had that time on your small still production facility, and then you were now learning from on the current day facility that you're at. So you had such a knowledge there that I didn't have, and I can't remember, but I remember there were some changes that we made. I think we may have decreased the amount of chocolate because we're using chocolate malt in our whiskey, as you may remember. We're using a pale chocolate malt and Munich and Crystal as our specialty malts. But it was so fun to get your feedback on that. And I have to say to you, so we're now releasing. We're just getting prepared to release the very last bit of the Westland whiskey, and I was just bottling the last bit of batch 3 yesterday, actually, with Cody, and bit bittersweet. I mean, it's really nice to get to this stage. I never would have thought that we would have gotten to this stage where we actually had whiskey, 3 batches on the shelf. But also a bit sad because we're getting to the end of that amazing whiskey that we made. And a lot of the reason why I think that is such a good whiskey, why I like it so much, is because of that back and forth that you and I had very early on, and so I'd love to get, if you can remember some of that, it'd be really fun to get your take on it. And then I would really like to get your take on, malt in general and specialty malts in particular, and how we're using that particular flavor driver in these whiskeys.
Yeah, well, I can remember, and again, it's been 7 years, so I'm doing my best. But
not much has happened in that time.
Yeah, it's. I think what I remember most is how good of a grasp you had on the implications of the variables that we could change.
That's good.
And I'm not fishing for but I really mean it. You were
great.
It was a really interesting discussion. We could talk about what the implications would be if we dialed back some of the roasted malts, or we used more of this roasted malt, or we changed the fermentation temperature. I know that we changed the maturation proof, things like that, and all of that stuff was very targeted. And that's the thing that was that's part of the fun of this process. Not just fun to work together, but it's also fun because those details matter. And that's part of Westland's thoughtfully made mantra. But it's also something that when you work with somebody who shares that philosophy and approach, where all these things do matter and they do make a difference, that makes the process that much more rewarding. It was excellent, the way that it came out.
Yeah.
So, I think I'm trying to remember here, because I want to say that we decreased the amount of roasted malts. Probably should have prepped for this.
No, it's fine. Because what I didn't appreciate, you don't have to remember all that, because these are details that I remember. Because
you remember is the more important thing.
Yeah, I remember big time, because
what was the grain bill of the first one?
Well, we've kept the same grain bill. We're basically 90% pale malts. We were using Great Western, and we were using 9% pale malt. Then we use a combo of basically Crystal, Munich, and pale chocolate. Pale chocolate's only 2%, and initially I had more than 2%. And I didn't realize the implications of that pale chocolate malt at the time as much as I do now. Like you I don't know if you did, but because I don't think, you're using a peated malt, a traditional peated malt for your, well, you should go into the details of that. But so I was using pale chocolate malt because I like the things that it added, but it adds a lot. It's a pretty unique people think of malts as malts. They're all the same. They can be vastly different. It's one of the fun things about making malt whiskey is, you can make corn different and you can make rye different, but malted barley is a massive world of tastes.
Absolutely. That was one of the things that drove us at the beginning. And again, it comes from the influence of the brewing industry. And for us, we use only 4% of our grain bill is pale chocolate malt. And we're using that same Thomas Fawcett, because as far as I know, they're still the only company in the world that makes it, based out of the UK. And it's a very specific malt type. And people who follow beer or know beer, those raw ingredients, there's a chocolate malt, and chocolate malts get used all the time to make like stouts and porters and things like that. 400 level bond, roast level. But the flavor is actually less chocolate and more coffee or more roast.
Yeah.
The pale chocolate malt had a little bit more kind of mocha sort of flavors to it. But
Yes.
again, even in our grain bill, it's only 4%, and ours was designed to be, a heavier, maltier grain bill. This is beginning to come back to me because we changed you wanted to do the 10% roasted malts, but also we changed the fermentation character to lessen the amount of esters relative to what we had, because we had this
Right.
really big, very flavorful Belgian Saison yeast, which was designed to go full tilt with 30% specialty malts.
Right.
So that was part of the intention. This is all beginning to come back. So now these things are getting balanced together. You guys are doing that balance, but in a more reserved
That's right.
sort of way, I guess.
That's
So
right. That's exactly right.
those roasted malts, the amount of possibility that exists in there is extraordinary. And that's one of the things that I think is quite interesting about what we have done with this collectively, you and I, with Stranahan's, but a bunch of other distilleries in the US, is like this could be done in Scotland, and that's one of these things. And Glenmorangie, to their credit, has done some with full chocolate malt.
Yeah.
But for the most part, it was, never approached. And I don't know, this is always the way that I would think, was just, well, why? It's just, I mean, this is what made me a really annoying and frustrating student, I think, when I was a kid. I would always ask those questions, and, why is this? Why does nobody use roasted malts? Why did the brewing industry for hundreds of years use these to develop hundreds of different styles of micro styles of beer?
Yeah.
And in whiskey, that it never jumped. And it's such a small jump, and it never jumped. And
Yeah, but
that's extraordinary.
it is, but it gets back to that thing that I love about America, and that's and there are pockets of this in many in all cultures, I would imagine. But one of the things that I think is very unique about the American culture is the not as big a fear to fail. And I think for most of these things, I would imagine most of the reason why these things are not done and why things are not changed is fear of failure, fear that it won't work, fear that people won't like it so much. And chocolate malt is so smoke is a polarizing taste. It's not for everybody, and we could go into that whole kettle of fish. But chocolate malt is a category, or that higher roasted, where there's a lot of energy added to that malt, it creates a subset or a set of tastes that are not for, well, I think they're more approachable depending on how you do them, but they aren't for everybody. And I think that that's part of it, and especially when you get a tradition like Scotch or Irish, where it's been done for so long, done a certain way for so long, it makes it makes it hard to change.
Well, and it's a couple things. One, it's flavor.
Yes.
Flavor is subjective.
Yes.
And that's one of these things that, as you begin to try to unravel the spool that is whiskey making over the course of the centuries, that was never an objective, not on the front end. On the back end, yes, but on the front end, whiskey as a business has been a commodity. It was, you take something that was made at this site versus this site, and you're doing it in the most efficient way possible using this grain. And then you take that and you buy and trade those things. I mean, that's, the malt whiskey industry in Scotland is defined by the blended whiskey industry. It's easy for us to forget now that single malts are so prevalent, but the thinking definitely is shaped by the blended whiskey industry. And, there's kind of three steps. The way that I've kind of thought about it is like, it went from being, here is a little bit of the extra agricultural product that we can make as a country, as a community. And that's, the 1700s into the 1800s, that's how whiskey distilling was. And then it became this commodity industrial product. And where we are today, where we're looking at it from the ground up in terms of flavor from raw ingredients, that has not happened. And to be honest, if we're being fair, it's a bit of a luxury. And we're able to do that yes, because I think part of us culturally, that's what's driving it. But at the same time, whiskey's never had it so good. And so now when we looked into it, we said, okay, whiskey's booming everywhere. And so when we started the company in 2010, that was still definitely true. So it was safe. We never thought about it any other way, but it might have been interesting if you want to like compare it to like like the brandy industry. Like some people are trying to break into the brandy industry, but brandy isn't having the same thing that's happening in whiskey. So, when you break into the brandy industry, do you try to be more like cognac, more conservative, or do you really try to go further out there? I don't know the answer, but the way that I feel like I have conceptualized, at least in my head, is that we joined this business, this industry, at a time where it felt quasi safe to start by innovating and looking at these things like roasted malts. But at the same time, I don't know that we would have done anything any differently, because the whole driving force for us, and it sounds like for you guys, was about flavor to begin with. And these,
Right.
the roasted malts is the biggest part of it, certainly for us.
Yeah. It is. I totally agree with you, and I think in this day and age too, as we've gone through this shutdown of coronavirus, it makes me thankful that we appreciated these things when we did, because I can't think. I mean, this is way more interesting to be producing something that is of interest and different and flavorful. The big trick that the big trick, well, there's a number of tricks. First of all, it's a trick to make really nice tasting things, but it's also a trick to figure out what people want to taste, and what you can't please everybody, and you want to please a set of people, obviously. Um, but when you start using specialty malts, you create flavors that are, and then you distill them. You're really concentrating some flavors, and um, I think it's an interesting thing as we do this for longer to sort of try to put yourself in the place of the consumer and say, what are the things that this person is going to like? I don't want to just make this for me. I mean, I like it, but I want other people to like it as well. Um, and that's tougher when you have such a blank slate, like we do with malted barley, where, like you say, I mean, the breadth of tastes within that category are tremendous, and it is something to think about. Is how do we make a product that's not just that people will like, that a lot of people will like,
Yeah, and I think being able to be confident in it and stick to your guns a little bit, where we are making a thing, we've got a vision for the way that we make whiskey that is focused on malted barley flavor, but is also driven by balance, balance with the malt, the yeast, the fermentation, and the oak. And you guys did the same thing, executed in a slightly different way, but still very much of the same philosophy.
That's right.
But there's a part of this where we make this thing, and to my earlier joke about nobody's ever done this before and we have no idea how it's going to taste, like, it wasn't really a joke. Like, it's true. And we don't know how it's going to taste, and you don't know how people are going to conceptualize it. The amount of times I had seen, especially in the earlier days, people tasting malt flavor, and like they didn't know how to, their brains, you could see it freeze, like, i'm
Yeah.
I'm tasting things that I've never tasted before in whiskey. And
Yeah.
that's a really cool thing to do. And honestly, for some people it's too much, and
Right.
some people, they don't want to push, and that's okay.
Yeah.
This world is big enough for all of us. But for those who are open to new tastes and new experiences, and especially ones where philosophically you're kind of in the same boat. And this is one of the things that has been very successful for us at Westland, is the people that are interested in flavors from raw ingredients. If they're into beer, if they're into wine, if they're into food, the type of those things, the versions of those things that are driven by flavor and raw ingredients, it is easier for them to wrap their minds around what is happening in the glass and
Yeah.
around what they're tasting. It's one thing to say, I like chocolate. Almost everybody likes chocolates. But do you like chocolate within the context of whiskey? And for some people, the answer is no, because whiskey means this.
Right.
And maybe that's because they've been drinking whiskey for 30 years, or maybe they've been drinking whiskey for 5 years and they've got a thing they really, really like. But for other people, their ability to parse new experiences and new flavors, that's the people that we're speaking to, certainly. And the part of that is that we have no other choice. This is where it comes back to the business side of it is, we're running a business at the same time.
Yeah.
We're never gonna out tradition Scotland.
They
And
have a bit of a head start.
they have a bit of a head start, and more power to them. Well, and the reality is, the thing that we talk to people all the time about is like, it would not be honest of us to say that we could.
No.
We don't. That's their tradition, and it's great, and it's awesome.
It's great.
And I respect it immensely.
Learned a ton from them.
Absolutely. But but we can build something new here and build something more. To me, it's always more compelling. That's what it comes down to, by being truthful to this place and not trying to rely on those old things. I never got the idea of trying to make something that is a clone just as good as Scotland. What's the point of that?
No, and I think that is a cultural thing. West Coast, Pacific Northwest, I think in particular. I don't know California as well as I know here, obviously. And I really, really love that. But what are some things that because we got to know each other, like I said, 7 years ago, and you were sort of past the very first steps of Westland, getting into sort of the middle ground, and now you've done a ton of things over the past 7 years. But what are things that stand out that you've learned over the past 7 years that you maybe didn't know or didn't think were so important, or new things that have become very important over this time, past 7 years or so?
Everything. I'm a huge believer in the concept that you never stop learning, and
no. But some things you learn you don't see coming, or you don't appreciate them until you've been, practicing them for a few years. And then you look back and you're like, that was actually quite important. I didn't realize it was that important, or that wasn't actually as important as I thought it was. That's the thing.
I think the thing that we have learned, that I have learned in particular, is how to have a soft hand. How to not force things into a box that they're not meant to be in. Our project with Gariana oak is a great example, right? So the oak species that grows, up and down the Pacific, Northwest. Right. What we were finding when we were maturing the first time with these barrels was, for our particular house style, it was too dominant at 100% of the maturation profile.
Yeah.
And it was interesting because a lot of the winemakers who started in the same process, back in the 90s, they were trying to do this too. They were trying to use Gary oak or Oregon oak. It's always called Oregon oak if you're in Oregon, but it's
that's Gary right. I can't get any because you guys take all the barrels and I can't get any. It's pissing me off.
You can't be taking all. There's more. I'll give you the guy.
There is now.
There is now, but there wasn't. There was
4 or 5 years ago. I couldn't get any.
Yeah, well, same for us actually. So not last year's edition, but the 2017 version of Gariana, the release, was smaller than the two previous releases. If I have that right, smaller than the first release that came before it, because we couldn't get any either.
Right.
There was one company that was producing it; they went out of business, and we didn't have any stock for 18 months.
Right.
And that's all part of the journey. So we share that with you, certainly.
Yeah.
But but that is a thing where you go, okay, you can do this with 100% Quercus alba with the virgin American white oak, but we can't do it with Quercus Gariana, at least not to our house style.
Right.
Okay. And begin to roll with it. And, and that's what the Gariana program, our release, Gariana, has become, is an exploration of rolling with the strengths of things that we've been given. I think that's one of the most important things, is not trying to shoehorn stuff. And that's remaining true for these, we're working on different barley varietals, Washington State Peat, a couple of other things, just the whiskey's going to want to fit itself together in a certain way.
So are you saying that it was maybe a bit naive to think that well, yeah. So my impression from that is that, there are certain tastes that are just too strong, too overpowering, that they don't fit well within that
Well,
idea that you've mentioned a few times of balance.
yeah, some people love it. Some people really like, I always describe it to people as like drinking Kansas City style barbecue sauce. And people who think I'm joking, like
Full
it's
on.
wild when you taste it. Like
Yeah.
it's something from directly from a barrel. It has those flavors. And some people, especially people I have found that are more bourbon enthusiasts who really like an oaky whiskey. Um, but for us, that wasn't what we wanted to do. Again, we're coming back to malted barley being the base of it and celebrating everything.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, and it's good that you bring up the barrel influence, and I also appreciate and I learned from you this idea of balance. We're putting together a number of variables here that create taste, different types of tastes, and balance is a key part of it because you would never want to overwhelm the wonderful tastes of barley by putting that whiskey in a new oak, heavily, a heavy oak impacting vessel for too long. And the white oak is one thing, but it sounds like the Gariana is an even stronger one. And there are other barrels that or woods that we can talk about with barrel. But we've had an amazing time. Well, what's been really fun for us is, as I said, we've just finished bottling our last bit of batch 3. So we started out with our first release was pretty much aged in new oak, and then we put it in a neutral cask for a few months, but it was pretty much a new oak whiskey. And then the second batch it was kept in a neutral cask for a while because again, I was seeing too much of an oak influence. So I put it in a pretty neutral, not as much to extract from these casks that we put it in next. And then the second batch was finished in a rum cask, very dark rum cask, lots of flavor. For about 6 to 8 months. And then this final whiskey, it spent a fair bit of time in the neutral cask, ex-bourbon, and then was finished for a very short time in a port wine cask, and I've been blown away by the evolution of the tastes in that whiskey, So starting out, same grain bill we've used now from the beginning, made all at your distillery using your stills, but then we've seen a progression of aging and the influence of the cask on the aging and the seasons, obviously the changing temperatures and humidity and so on. And it is amazing the difference in those whiskeys. Like, it blows my mind that they're actually starting out with the same life. The first 3 years is identical. It's just the last bit, and it's incredible what we've changed or what's changed.
yeah, and on top of that, the fact that doing something in a rum cask or doing something in a port cask is given new life and new meaning by the fact that we're using roasted malts or
Yes.
a different yeast strain. That's, to me, one of the really exciting things about using these is, you expect to see some difference with these casks depending upon the quality of the cask or how active it is, but then to see the interchange and to see how these things work together,
Yes.
malt flavor, rum cask flavor, port cask flavor, and not just as two separate things in a flavor profile, but combining together
Yeah.
and creating something new. That's quite extraordinary.
It is.
That's where whiskey doesn't end. It continues all the time, and
Yeah.
you
And
get
it
a lot of
isn't, it
delight out of
isn't,
that.
sorry, what was that again? What was the
Oh,
last thing?
nothing. It's just it's a constant source of delight.
Yeah.
It's just stuff that you find that you don't necessarily know what's going to happen. You can have a hypothesis
Yeah.
and you can have a general idea, but sometimes you get the stuff that comes together. You're like, wow, that's really cool.
Yeah. What I was amazed by, so the earlier batch that we released had quite a smoke. It wasn't the same as a peat smoke, and my assumption was it was from the the pale chocolate malt. But what's also fun to see is, like you say, there's the added taste that you're adding with, let's say, a rum cask or a port wine cask. But then you also see a mellowing and a decreasing of certain flavors. Like smoke is the easy one. I mean, that it's amazing how smoke evolves over the life of a whiskey when it's aging in a wooden cask. You lose a fair bit of smoke when you distill, but you also lose, or smoke changes and mellows, and it seems to become less harsh, less sharp, just by sitting in a cask, especially a neutral cask. I think, it just time in a cask and exposure to oxygen changes smoke a lot.
Yeah, it's I don't know if they've updated this, but back when I was doing my Harry Watts studies, they had mentioned that about peat phenolics in particular, and that is measured as decreasing throughout maturation, but they couldn't pinpoint why. And I thought that was very interesting. Why are these phenolics dropping? And of course, when you're maturing something in new oak, you've got the synergies of phenolic flavors from the cask.
Yeah.
So in the toast layer of the oak, it's the same basic chemical family of phenolics. So your eugenols, your spices, you've got some smokiness in there. So that's when people taste smoke in whiskey that's not peated. That's where they're tasting it from. So those things have a synergistic quality. But yeah, even those will decrease over time. And that's, this is one of the beautiful things about whiskey, right? Is that there are still mysteries,
Oh
I
no.
love that.
Yeah.
I love that we're still figuring stuff out.
I do too. I'm quite grateful for a lot of the knowledge that we have, because I would suck to put so much energy into something and have it taste terrible. But yes.
True.
But and the other thing that I have come to appreciate, which I didn't early on in this experience, is the importance of the neutral cask. The cask that doesn't add, there's not as much flavor to extract from those wood staves, but the effect of oxygen and the movement in and out of the wood in a more neutral cask that's already had a spirit sitting in it for a long time, it's really, I didn't know it was so helpful and important, but I've come to appreciate it a lot. I now have, there are some favorite neutral casts that I never want to give away. That's going to be a cast that we will, or a group of casts that we will keep for a long time, purely for that sort of neutral environment for oxygen and heat to interplay.
Yeah, same. I think 30% of the whiskey that we fill on an annual basis is in refill casks.
Yeah.
And that they play a huge role, but you're exactly right. They play a role that isn't obvious at
Yeah.
first, either to whiskey makers or to consumers, because the new oak gets a lot of credit, and it does a lot, right? But the kind of the one that's always in the background, and it's doing a lot of this work that's harder to explain to people. All this the oxidative reaction stuff.
Yes.
That's people tend to think of maturation as extraction of
Yeah.
cask, and that's a part of it, but it's not the whole thing, certainly.
No.
And there's the oxidative part of it and the esterification part that are driving these, chemical changes. And that continues in casks that don't have as much flavor extract to give. And that's where the evolution happens. And it's a fine balance. You need to have a cask that isn't completely spent. Now that takes a long time, to have
Yeah.
a cask that has basically nothing left to give.
Right.
But balancing that between a virgin oak cask and that that's a real sweet spot. We're finding that our own cast that we're refilling again. I don't know if you've done any of this at all yourself, but
Just starting now.
yeah, we're really liking that. It's a really interesting you know dynamic between a virgin oak cask and then a bourbon cask, but then you can reuse. We're reusing some of those again
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.
And again, all of that stuff leads to the sense of discovery and allows you to stretch what is possible, and we
Yeah.
don't know what's going to happen by leaving these things in those casks for 7-8 years instead of the kind of 3 to 6 that's our typical 8 window.
Yeah. And the other thing that we're lucky to be able to appreciate is, so now I've taken that grain bill and I've made it at a number of different distilleries in places people well. They know their thing. They're making the right steps. They're doing the right thing, but different shape stills, different processes, different water, sometimes different yeast, but not big differences. I don't think that those are major big variable differences. And already we're now able, and again, we're having that whiskey go through a similar maturation process as we did for our first 3 releases, and already we're appreciating differences, and that is really fun, because um, that's not common. I mean, you know, it would be like you being able to have two different distilleries.
Yeah,
And
about to say that's a cool thing that you get that we don't.
yeah, it's and
Yeah.
it's great, you know. And what I really love too is getting to know the very, because as you know, there's some characters in this industry, and you know, big, awesome people that have big character, big personalities, wonderful people. Some of them a little crazy, and like us probably, we could be called a little bit crazy. And what I have learned from them, the different things that they've stressed at different times, has been really, really nice. And I have to say though that there are many, many things that we talked about in our interaction that I still remember. And I think, you know, if I hadn't mentioned before, I think you're doing a tremendous job for the industry in general. Yeah, and it's great. I hope you're enjoying it. I hope you're finding a way to making it sustainable, because um, you know, the other thing I wanted to ask you is, because I've now spoken to a lot of consumers, and I've also now gotten to know people in the industry more and more. And we're in a good place. We're I think most people realize that we're trying to make good whiskey, and we are making good whiskey. But we're still a new category, and we're trying to make people or help people realize what we're doing, why we're doing it this way, and how it's different, and why it's different. But what are your thoughts on that? I mean, how are we doing, and what can we do better for this category of American single malt?
Oh man. I mean, the category thing is so exciting to me personally. I mean, it
Totally.
became very clear at about the halfway point in our life as a business, 2015, 2016, that um, that there needed to be something there. There needed to be some way of talking about this category, this thing that we were making, that we make only this. You know, a lot of other distilleries making single malt make, you know, a gin
That's
and
right.
herb, and
That's
we
right.
make only this thing. And it doesn't, you know, the framework within which to conceptualize it for customers doesn't exist. And that's quite an interesting thing to solve. But it was also, it was very easy. You know, it was, well, there is no category, so let's make one. And this is a very Westland thing to do. I mean, and it wasn't, obviously it wasn't that easy, but it's the same thing. Like, well, what's stopping us? You know, and so you know that, you know, again, long story, relatively short, snowballed from, you know, us having a conversation internally to nine other producers to now more than 160 producers of single malt whiskey in this country, separate producers of single malt whiskey in this country.
I read that the other day. I think it was with on a commission site or something, maybe.
Yeah,
So I was like,
the numbers keep
is that
growing.
real? Is that like,
Yeah,
is that happening? Like that?
yeah, yeah.
That's
It's wild. You know, I mean, it's a mixture of, yeah, and it has to be distillers producing something. You know, producing single malt whiskey. You can't. Um, I mean, people who sign up in support of the category, that's great, but they're sorted into a separate box. But if you're making single malt whiskey, that, you know, that number is 160 distilleries.
that's
Uh,
and how do you think do you think we've crossed the chasm with the consumer in terms of them realizing what we're doing and how it's different from bourbon and rye?
Not even close.
Pardon
Not
me?
even close.
Yeah, I don't think so either. And
Yeah.
so how do we do that? How do we, you know, my sense on it is we want to make something that's clearly different and obviously good, but not so different and off the side yet that people can't get there, or it's too big of a leap for folks, you know. But what
Yeah.
is your take on that?
To me, that's where the category definition, you know, that's where that starts. And having the words mean something. You know, I believe this very strongly, that words have meaning, and I feel like, not to spiral and be sad about society, but I feel like in society these days words have less meaning and less importance. But I still very much believe that words have meaning. And you know, the words American single malt whiskey on a label, you know, these words should mean something in particular, and they don't today. You know, and
No.
that's, if you start there, if you start with a base of integrity, you know, then we can go from there, and then we can transition into trying to get people an understanding and looking at quality, but starting with the base of integrity, that's so important. Bourbon can start there, right? Bourbon as a category has some definition to it. Are there bad bourbons out there? Yeah, of course. Are there bad Scotch whiskeys out there? Yes, of course. But at least there's an understanding of what the rules are, the rules of the game. And
Right.
will you have some bad apples there? Yes. But the fact that we're starting on a good foot with our eventual customers, I think is really important. So that's the base. Beyond that, I think we look at what does American single malt whiskey have to offer, and to me, it's a no brainer. And maybe that's because I'm exposed to it all the time. But bourbons and ryes, it's a couple of things. Bourbons and ryes have a lot of history in this country, and they have a great history in this country. And I'm not taking away from that at all.
No.
But like the Scottish whiskey industry, they've tended to been pretty static, especially over the past 30 or 40 years. And like the Scottish whiskey industry, it has been become an industrial process, even if it's good. They approach corn and rye respectively the same way that most of the Scottish whiskey industry approaches barley.
Right.
But at the other side of it is what we were saying, I think at the very beginning, is this is a great barley growing country. For people who are seeking things out because they believe that it should be connected to a place. The western part of the United States and also Western Canada grows some of the best barley in the world, grows a lot of barley.
Right.
That's so you have, kind of the basis of integrity of producers. You have this kind of rooting of agriculture. Yes, we grow corn in this country. Yes, we grow rye in this country, but we also grow barley. And especially in this part of the country, we grow barley much better than we grow corn. It really thrives here. And then on top of that, as a category, is what we've been talking about this whole time, which is the approach and the innovation that we have, right? If you want traditional things, if you want, an 18-year-old such and such that has been made the same way that hasn't been made the same way for a long time, but that's a different story. But if you want that philosophy, that exists.
Right.
But if what you want is exciting new things in whiskey, to me, American single malt's great strength is in its diversity. You've got people who are approaching things with roasted malts, different yeast strains, different oak types, different, wine casks, rum casks, beer casks, and it runs the gamut, right? From super conservative to, super kind of progressive, and in terms of a whiskey making style and how they approach raw ingredients, and that's awesome. There's so much more diversity in the American single malts that you already see today compared to what you would see out of the Scottish whiskey industry. So, that's something that, to be fair, a lot of people who drink whiskey aren't used to that. They're not used to knowing that you can have that. A lot of people who drink wine know that, and a lot of people who drink beer know that. So that's where we find a lot of people who come into, our business, into drinking Westland, coming from that side of it, because they're excited to try new things. And that's what American single malt, to me, that's how we reach people in my mind.
Yeah, I agree. And I think then, so to paraphrase you, I think what we're trying to do as producers is not overpower tastes. Like, for example, not overpower those wonderful barley tastes with time in a new oak cask for too long, or the various things. But my sense is I think that's a theme that you are trying to say and stress, is this balance of taste, and you can go in various different directions, but let's not try and overpower it with one particular thing. Would that be right to say?
Yeah, that's certainly our approach. And I think, and maybe that's a product of our generation sort of thing, is, because we're starting from the ground up by focusing on raw ingredients as the baseline. A lot of the stuff that we have done has been about limiting input. Just like we've taken some stuff that was a new oak and racked it into used bourbon casks or things like that to keep that balance. Because what's the point of celebrating this whole new category, single malt whiskey in America, made out of malted barley, if you can't taste it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. I mean, just go buy a bourbon then, if that's the case.
Yeah. Are you excited for the future, Matt? I know it's a crazy time right now, and we're gonna wrap up now because we've taken an hour, at least an hour of your time. But Are you looking for, are you optimistic? I mean, I'm optimistic. I look forward to the future. I think I am that way inherently, but with all the shit that's going on these days, it can be difficult. Are you optimistic about what we have in the future and American single malt in particular?
Yeah, I am. And it's something that sounds, maybe if I look back on this a few years from now, sound ridiculous given the current context of the times. But I really am, because I think what we're doing here in American single malts is right.
Yeah.
We're not trying to pawn some bullshit off on somebody. We're not following a trend. No, it's true. I
I
think that
know.
there's a lot of people
I don't
who.
think you could pawn bullshit, Matt. You have too honest a face. You
That's
just
true.
it
That's
wouldn't
true. I
work. It just
couldn't.
wouldn't work.
But that's no, I wouldn't be very good at that at all. But no, but that's why I can speak passionately about this stuff, because I believe in it. And I
Yeah.
believe very strongly in not just what we're doing at Westland, what you guys are doing, but also what the category is doing. Um, there's a lot of people who get into this industry for the wrong reasons, not just the whiskey industry, the spirits industry, and they can hook their wagon up to a different concept. But we've been trying to do something because we believe that there's something to offer the world. Not just to chase, the numbers that say bourbon is rising at X percent, which was true for a while and is beginning to taper off, of course. And at the end of the day, that I have enough faith in humanity, believe it or not, that is going to work over the long haul. That making something that is true and honest and compelling and delicious will win the day.
Yeah, I agree. And I also think that we're also, I think with the thing, I love the fact that we are able to work together. The fact that we were able to work together is, I mean, it's a bit of a small miracle, but you guys, you said yes to us working together. You said yes to bringing our ingredients up to your new distillery. You said yes to, you even said yes to, this is the thing that I think about many times when I look at our casks in the barn. Back when we started as a small distillery, we couldn't buy the good casks. We couldn't get them. We just couldn't get on their lists because we were so small. And you guys sold us those casks, those new casks. That's why those ones have Westland on them. They were yours.
Yeah.
And I have to say that I'm very grateful for that. We've been having a ball at Wanderback, and we have new people now, Cody and Maggie, who are working with us, who are great, and we're really having a ball with it. Now people are starting to see us and appreciate what we're doing, and it all happened because of the things that you guys said you would do, and so I'm optimistic as well. I think that if we continue to work together, we're going to create a tradition here that's good and compelling, and as long as we stick to our guns and or I shouldn't say that, but as long as we stick to our convictions, where we're trying to be honest and make things the way that we think are the right way, I think we'll succeed. I'm optimistic, and but Matt, I want to thank you, buddy. It's after 6. It's a pleasure. I could talk to you for hours with but I hope we get to do this again. I hope we get to see each other and hang out in person. I really hope we can get you down to the farm. We've made some wonderful changes down there, and it would be so fun to. I know we were going to do it actually during the Portland meeting that got canceled.
Yep, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, so we'll do it again. It'd be really a treat to have you down and have a nice meal and a bit of whiskey at the farm.
Well, the beauty of being in this business, as you know, is that it's a long-term proposition. So,
Yeah, that's right.
so we'll be down there before we know it.
Well, good luck to you. Good luck with everything now. And thanks to our listeners for listening. We hope you enjoyed this chat, and we have more to come. And I really hope we get to speak to Matt again. It's been a real treat, I must say. It's been too long, but take care of yourselves, all of yourselves. Have a good evening, Sunday evening. Maggie, did you have anything to say?
Yeah, I just want to thank you, Matt, again for joining us, and everyone on YouTube now and on the Zoom call. If you are interested at all in buying or tasting any of these, we do sell sample kits of these whiskeys. So if you want to try this collaboration, you can head over to Wanderback and try all 3. But again, thank you so much for joining us and taking a chance on us 7 years ago, and enjoy the rest of your Sunday.
It was a real pleasure. You know, thanks guys. And yeah, we'll definitely do this again in the future.
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you.
Stay well. Be safe. Good
Bye.
night.
Okay. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank
Thanks.
you.